The morning sun cast long shadows across Westminster Abbey as Archbishop Michael Williams adjusted his ceremonial robes for the final time. Today was different from any other Christmas broadcast in British history. King Charles III had requested something unprecedented, a live address from within the sacred walls where monarchs had been crowned for nearly 1,000 years. Sarah Mitchell, the BBC's head of royal coverage, nervously checked her watch as technicians positioned cameras throughout the ancient abbey. At 62, she had covered countless royal events, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional weight of this particular broadcast. The king's recent health struggles had been kept largely private, but whispers in the corridors of Buckingham Palace suggested this Christmas message would be profoundly personal. 5 minutes to positions, called David Chen, the broadcast director, his voice echoing through the Gothic arches. The Abbey felt different today, not just because of the television equipment, but because of an almost tangible sense of anticipation that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Margaret Thompson sat in her small flat in Liverpool, her arthritic hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. At 87, she had watched every Christmas broadcast since Queen Elizabeth II began the tradition in 1957. Her late husband Robert had served as a palace guard for 30 years, and their modest home was filled with photographs and memories from royal occasions. Today felt different, though she couldn't quite explain why. The doorbell rang, and Margaret slowly made her way to answer it. Her granddaughter Emma stood outside, her cheeks red from the December cold, carrying a bag of groceries and wearing a concerned expression. "Gran, I thought you might want some company for the King's speech today," Emma said, stepping inside and immediately beginning to bustle around the small kitchen. "I brought your favorite biscuits and some fresh milk for your tea." Margaret smiled warmly at her granddaughter's thoughtfulness. Emma, at 28, worked as a nurse at the local children's hospital and rarely had Christmas Day off. The fact that she had made the effort to visit meant more than Margaret could express. Meanwhile, across London in a modest terraced house in Southwark, James Foster sat with his 8-year-old daughter Lucy, helping her arrange the Christmas presents under their small tree. James, a single father since his wife's death 2 years ago, had been struggling to make ends meet working 2 jobs, one at a local supermarket and another cleaning offices at night. "Daddy, why does the king talk to everyone on Christmas?" Lucy asked, her bright eyes full of curiosity as she carefully placed a homemade card addressed to King Charles under the tree. James paused, considering how to explain the tradition to his daughter in a way she would understand. "Well, sweetheart, it's like when you want to say something important to your whole class at school. The king wants to share his thoughts with everyone in the country, especially on Christmas when we're all thinking about family and being grateful for what we have." Lucy nodded solemnly, then brightened. "I wrote him a letter asking if he's okay because Grandma Rose said he's been sick. Do you think he'll read it?" James felt his heart tighten. His mother-in-law, Rose, had been battling cancer for the past year, and Lucy had become acutely aware of illness and mortality in a way no child should have to. "I'm sure he would appreciate knowing that you care about him, Lucy. That's what Christmas is about, caring for each other." Back at Westminster Abbey, King Charles III stood in a small side chamber, reviewing his handwritten notes one final time. At 77, he had waited longer than any heir in British history to become monarch, and the weight of the crown had been heavier than he had ever imagined. The past year had brought challenges that had tested not just his physical strength but his emotional resilience. His private secretary, Lady Catherine Hartwell, entered quietly. "Your Majesty, they're ready for you. The broadcast will reach an estimated 800 million people worldwide." Charles nodded, folding his notes and placing them in his jacket pocket. "Catherine, in all your years of service, have you ever felt the weight of words so acutely?" Lady Hartwell, who had served the royal family for over 20 years, met his gaze with understanding. "Your Majesty, authenticity has always been your greatest strength. Today, that authenticity will touch hearts in ways we cannot yet imagine." In a care home in Edinburgh, 93-year-old William MacLeod sat in his wheelchair by the window, looking out at the snow-covered gardens. A veteran of the Korean War, William had dedicated his life to public service after returning from combat. His daughter Helen sat beside him, holding his hand as they waited for the broadcast to begin. "Dad, do you remember when you met the then Prince Charles at that veterans ceremony in 1995? Helen asked gently. William's eyes, though clouded with age, sparkled with the memory. I do." He listened, truly listened when I told him about the lads we lost. Not many people in his position would have taken the time to hear an old soldier's stories. Helen squeezed her father's hand. William had been diagnosed with dementia 6 months ago, and moments of clarity were becoming increasingly rare. But the royal family had always held a special place in his heart, representing the continuity and stability he had fought to protect. At Westminster Abbey, the cameras began rolling as the opening credits of the Christmas broadcast played for audiences worldwide. Sarah Mitchell watched from the control room as the king walked slowly down the nave, his footsteps echoing in the hushed silence of the ancient building. The image that filled television screens around the world was striking: King Charles III, dressed not in ornate ceremonial robes but in a simple dark suit, walking alone through the abbey where his mother had been crowned 72 years earlier. The weight of history seemed to follow him with each step. Dr. Patricia Williams, a professor of constitutional history at Oxford, watched from her study with a mixture of professional interest and personal emotion. She had written extensively about the monarchy's role in modern Britain, but today she found herself setting aside academic analysis in favor of human empathy. Her neighbor, retired teacher Martin Davies, had joined her for the broadcast. At 74, Martin had taught thousands of children about British history and had always emphasized the human stories behind the grand events. Today, he sensed they were about to witness one of those pivotal human moments that would be remembered for generations. "He looks different," Martin observed quietly. "There's something in his bearing, something deeply personal about the way he's moving through that space." Patricia nodded. "The Abbey isn't just a building to him. It's where he was invested as Prince of Wales, where he married Diana, where his mother's coronation took place. Every step he takes is weighted with memory." In a homeless shelter in Manchester, coordinator Susan Phillips gathered the 23 residents around an old television set. Many of the people staying at the shelter had complex relationships with authority and tradition, but something about this particular broadcast had drawn their attention. "Why are we watching this?" asked Tommy, a former soldier who had struggled with addiction since leaving the army 5 years ago. Susan, who had worked with homeless populations for 15 years, understood the question's deeper meaning. "Sometimes," she said gently, "we all need to hear that someone in a position of power understands what it means to struggle, to feel lost, to wonder if tomorrow will be better than today." The broadcast began in earnest as King Charles III took his position before the altar of Westminster Abbey. The lighting was soft, almost intimate, creating an atmosphere more reminiscent of a personal conversation than a formal state address. "My dear friends," the king began, his voice carrying clearly through the Abbey and into homes across the United Kingdom and Commonwealth realms, "I speak to you today from Westminster Abbey, a place that has witnessed centuries of joy and sorrow, celebration and reflection." He paused, and viewers worldwide could sense the deliberate weight of his words. This was not the usual polished rhetoric of royal addresses, but something far more personal and immediate. This Christmas finds our world facing challenges that test our resolve, our compassion, and our faith in one another. In recent months, I have been reminded of my own mortality and the precious, fragile nature of the time we are given. Back in Liverpool, Margaret Thompson set down her teacup with shaking hands. Emma reached over and gently took her grandmother's arm, sensing the emotional impact of the king's words. "He's speaking from the heart," Margaret whispered. "In all my years of watching these broadcasts, I've never heard a monarch speak so humanly." The king continued, his voice steady but filled with unmistakable emotion. "I have walked through this abbey many times in my life, for celebration, for ceremony, for moments of profound personal significance. Today, I walk with you through the uncertainties and hopes that define our shared humanity." In Southwark, James Foster found himself blinking back tears as Lucy leaned against his shoulder. His daughter was too young to fully understand the significance of what they were witnessing, but she could sense the weight of the moment. "Daddy, why does the king sound sad?" Lucy asked quietly. James struggled to find the right words. "I don't think he's sad, sweetheart. I think he's being honest about how hard life can be sometimes, even for kings." The cameras captured King Charles III moving slowly through the abbey, stopping occasionally to touch a pillar or look up at the soaring arches above. Each gesture seemed deliberate, as if he was drawing strength from the building itself and the generations of people who had sought solace within its walls. "In this sacred space," he said, I am reminded that leadership is not about the authority of position, but about the courage to be vulnerable, to acknowledge our shared struggles, and to offer hope not because everything is easy, but because together we can face whatever comes. The broadcast was unlike anything royal watchers had ever seen. This was not pageantry or tradition for its own sake, but a genuine attempt to connect with people across all walks of life who were struggling with their own challenges and uncertainties. As the first portion of his address concluded, King Charles III stood at the tomb of the unknown warrior, a memorial to those who had died in service to their country. The symbolism was not lost on viewers who understood that this Christmas broadcast was itself an act of service, a monarch choosing to be present with his people in their difficulties rather than above them in ceremonial distance. The impact of these opening moments rippled through homes, hospitals, care facilities, and shelters across the nation. People who had never paid particular attention to royal broadcasts found themselves deeply moved by the authentic humanity they were witnessing. This was more than a Christmas message, it was a moment of genuine connection between a monarch and his people, mediated not by protocol or tradition, but by shared recognition of what it means to be human in an uncertain world. King Charles III moved deeper into Westminster Abbey, the cameras following his deliberate journey through corridors that had witnessed coronations, royal weddings, and state funerals for nearly a millennium. His next words would forever change how the British people understood their monarchy. "Today, I must share with you something that weighs heavily on my heart," the king continued, his voice carrying through the ancient stones and into millions of homes. "6 months ago, my doctors discovered that I am facing a serious illness. While I continue to receive excellent care and remain hopeful about my treatment, I have learned that uncertainty about the future is something we must embrace rather than fear." In the control room at Westminster Abbey, Sarah Mitchell felt the air leave her lungs. Despite the rumors and whispers, hearing the king acknowledge his illness so directly sent shockwaves through the production team. This was not the carefully managed disclosure they had expected, but raw honesty that would reshape public perception of the monarchy forever. David Chen, the broadcast director, quickly gestured to his camera operators to maintain their steady shots. Whatever personal emotions the crew might be feeling, their professional responsibility was to capture this historic moment with dignity and respect. The reaction across the country was immediate and profound. In her Liverpool flat, Margaret Thompson began to weep quietly, her hand pressed to her heart. The king's words had transported her back to the bedside of her husband Robert during his final illness 15 years earlier. "Oh, Emma," she whispered to her granddaughter, "he's telling us the truth. After all these years of formal speeches and careful words, he's actually telling us the truth." Emma, who had spent her career caring for critically ill children and their families, recognized the courage it took for anyone to acknowledge mortality so publicly. "Gran, do you remember when Grandpa Robert told me he wasn't afraid of dying because he had lived a life of meaning? I think that's what the king is trying to tell us." Margaret nodded through her tears. "Your grandfather always said that facing the truth with dignity was the most important thing a person could do. The king is showing us what that looks like." Meanwhile, in Edinburgh, William MacLeod gripped his daughter Helen's hand with surprising strength. The mention of illness had penetrated the fog of his dementia, triggering a moment of startling clarity. "He's a good man," William said, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "Takes courage to tell people you're dying. I've seen men face enemy fire with less bravery than that takes." Helen felt tears rolling down her cheeks. Her father's words reminded her of conversations they had shared about his own diagnosis 6 months earlier. The parallel between her father's struggle with dementia and the king's acknowledgement of his illness created a connection she hadn't expected. At the homeless shelter in Manchester, the room had fallen completely silent. Susan Phillips watched as residents who usually struggled to focus on anything for more than a few minutes remained completely absorbed in the king's words. Tommy, the veteran who had initially questioned why they were watching, sat forward in his chair. "He's not trying to make us feel sorry for him," he said quietly. "He's saying we're all in this together, isn't he?" Susan nodded, recognizing the profound impact of the king's honesty on people who had often felt abandoned by society's institutions. Sometimes the most powerful thing someone can do is admit they don't have all the answers. Back at Westminster Abbey, King Charles III continued his unprecedented address. He had moved to stand before the coronation chair, the ancient seat where English and British monarchs had been crowned for over 700 years. I stand before this chair where my mother sat during her coronation in 1953, where I myself will never sit," he said with quiet dignity. "But I realize now that the true measure of a monarch is not found in ceremony or tradition, but in the willingness to share our common humanity with those we serve." In Southwark, James Foster found himself struggling to maintain composure as Lucy looked up at him with wide, concerned eyes. "Daddy, is the king going to die?" she asked with the directness that only children possess. James took a deep breath, remembering similar conversations he had been forced to have after his wife's death. "Lucy, all people die eventually. But the important thing is how we live and love while we're here. The king is showing us that even when we're scared or sick, we can still choose to be kind and honest with the people we care about." Lucy considered this seriously. "Like Mommy did when she was sick?" "Exactly like Mommy did," James replied, his voice thick with emotion. The broadcast continued as King Charles III shared more personal reflections on illness, mortality, and the responsibility of leadership during uncertain times. He spoke about sleepless nights spent worrying about the future, about conversations with doctors that had forced him to confront his own limitations, and about the unexpected peace that had come with accepting uncertainty as part of the human experience. Dr. Patricia Williams, watching from her Oxford study, realized she was witnessing a fundamental shift in the nature of royal communication. "Martin," she said to her neighbor, "this isn't just a Christmas broadcast. This is the monarchy evolving in real time." Martin Davies, the retired teacher, nodded slowly. "I've taught children about kings and queens for 40 years, but I've never seen anything like this." He's not speaking as a monarch to his subjects. He's speaking as one human being to other human beings who are all trying to figure out how to live meaningful lives in difficult circumstances. The king's words continued to resonate through the abbey and into the hearts of his listeners. "In these months since my diagnosis, I have been humbled by the letters, cards, and messages I have received from people facing their own challenges. A mother writing from a hospital where her child receives treatment. A man who lost his job and wonders how he will provide for his family. An elderly woman caring for her husband with dementia." In Edinburgh, Helen MacLeod gasped softly. 3 weeks earlier, she had written a letter to Buckingham Palace describing her father's condition and her own struggles as his primary caregiver. She had never imagined that the king might actually read such correspondence, let alone reference it in his Christmas broadcast. "Dad," she whispered, "I think he might be talking about us." William's eyes remained clear and focused. "Course he is, love. That's what a proper king does. He pays attention to his people." King Charles III continued, "These letters have taught me that the crown I wear is not a symbol of separation from the struggles of daily life, but a responsibility to acknowledge and honor those struggles. Every person facing illness, loss, financial hardship, or uncertainty is showing the same courage that has been asked of monarchs throughout history." The emotional weight of these words reverberated through homes across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth. In Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth realms, families gathered around televisions found themselves deeply moved by their sovereign's vulnerability and authenticity. At Westminster Abbey, the technical crew worked with professional precision while simultaneously processing the historic nature of what they were documenting. Camera operator Michael Reynolds, a veteran of 30 years covering royal events, later said that he had never felt such a profound sense of responsibility to capture not just images, but the emotional truth of a moment. The king moved to the altar area of the abbey, where he paused before a simple arrangement of Christmas flowers, not the elaborate displays typically associated with royal events, but modest seasonal blooms that might grace any parish church. "Christmas reminds us that hope often comes in unexpected forms," he said. "Not in grand gestures or magnificent displays, but in quiet acts of love, in honest conversations about difficult truths, and in the courage to remain present with one another even when the future is uncertain." In Liverpool, Margaret Thompson had stopped crying and was now listening with the intense focus of someone recognizing profound truth. Her granddaughter Emma sat beside her, equally absorbed in the king's words. "You know, Emma," Margaret said quietly, "when your grandfather was dying, he told me that the most important thing wasn't how much time we had left, but how honestly we used the time we were given. I think that's what His Majesty is trying to tell us." Emma nodded, thinking of the families she worked with in the children's hospital. "Gran, I see parents every day who have to find strength they didn't know they had." Hearing the king talk about his own fears and hopes it makes their courage seem even more remarkable. The broadcast continued with King Charles III reflecting on the nature of service, duty, and love in the face of mortality. His words were creating ripple effects of emotion and understanding across the nation, touching people who had never expected to feel such a personal connection to their monarch. In homeless shelters, care homes, hospitals, and family living rooms across the country, people were discovering that their struggles with illness, loss, financial hardship, and uncertainty were not isolating experiences but shared aspects of human existence that even kings must face. This Christmas broadcast was becoming something unprecedented in British history, not just a ceremonial address from sovereign to subjects, but a genuine conversation about what it means to live with courage, dignity, and hope in the face of life's inevitable challenges. As King Charles III continued his unprecedented Christmas address, he moved toward a simple wooden lectern that had been placed near the Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey. This section of the ancient building housed memorials to some of Britain's greatest writers and thinkers, and the symbolism was deliberate. Today, the king was adding his own words to the literary legacy of the nation. In recent weeks, I have received thousands of letters from people across our realm and throughout the Commonwealth, the king said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing several handwritten pages. With your permission, I would like to share some of their words with you today, because they have taught me more about courage and hope than any book of philosophy or theology ever could. The decision to read personal correspondence during a royal Christmas broadcast was unprecedented. In the control room, Sarah Mitchell held her breath, realizing that they were documenting something that would fundamentally change how future generations understood the relationship between monarchy and people. King Charles III unfolded the first letter, his reading glasses catching the soft light filtering through the Abbey's stained glass windows. "This comes from Sarah in Birmingham," he began. She writes, "Your Majesty, I am a single mother of 3 children, and I have been battling breast cancer for 8 months. There are days when I wonder how I will find the strength to keep going. But then, I look at my children, and I remember that love is stronger than fear. I wanted you to know that you are in our prayers, and that your honesty about your illness has helped me feel less alone in mine." The king paused, allowing the weight of Sarah's words to settle. Across the country, viewers were experiencing a profound shift in their understanding of what this Christmas broadcast represented. This was not pageantry or ceremony, but genuine human connection mediated through shared vulnerability. In a small flat in Birmingham, 34-year-old Sarah Chen sat with her 3 children, 10-year-old Michael, 8-year-old Sophie, and 6-year-old David, watching in amazement as the king read her letter aloud. She had written to Buckingham Palace 3 weeks earlier during a particularly difficult night following chemotherapy, never imagining that her words would reach such a vast audience. "Mummy, that's your letter!" Sophie exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she pulled her children closer. The king's decision to share her words publicly had transformed her private struggle into something that might help other families facing similar challenges. "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered. "I wrote to the king because I wanted him to know that we care about him, just like he cares about us." Michael, the eldest, looked thoughtful. "Does this mean the king is sick like you are, Mummy?" Sarah nodded, choosing honesty over protection. "Yes, love. Sometimes even kings get sick. But look how brave he's being, talking to everyone about it. That's what courage looks like." Back at Westminster Abbey, King Charles III continued reading. "This letter comes from Robert in Glasgow. He writes, 'Your Majesty, I am 78 years old, and I lost my wife of 52 years last spring. I have been struggling with loneliness and wondering what purpose my life has now that she is gone. When I heard you were ill, I realized that we are all facing the same questions about what matters most in the time we have left. I wanted you to know that your service to our country has always mattered to me, and it matters even more now that I understand we are both learning to live with loss.'" In a modest council flat in Glasgow, Robert Macpherson sat alone in his armchair, his wife Margaret's photograph resting on the table beside him. He had written that letter during one of his darkest moments, 6 weeks after Margaret's funeral, when the silence in their small home had become unbearable. Hearing his words read by the king in Westminster Abbey felt surreal, but, more than that, it felt healing. His private grief had become part of a larger conversation about love, loss, and the search for meaning in life's final chapters. Robert picked up Margaret's photograph, speaking to her as he had done every day since her death. "Did you hear that, love? The king read our letter. You always said that sharing our troubles makes them lighter. I think you were right. The king's voice carried clearly through the abbey as he read another letter. This comes from Maria in Manchester. She writes, Your Majesty, I work as a cleaner in a hospital, and I see people facing illness every day. I have noticed that the patients who do best are not necessarily those with the best prognosis, but those who feel connected to other people who understand their struggles. Your willingness to talk openly about your illness shows us all that we do not have to face our fears alone. Thank you for reminding us that vulnerability is not weakness, but the foundation of genuine human connection. At Manchester Royal Infirmary, 56-year-old Maria Santos was finishing her night shift when a colleague called her to the break room where several staff members had gathered around a small television. When she heard the king reading her letter, Maria felt a profound sense of validation for the work she had been doing for 23 years. I can't believe he read that, she whispered to her colleague Janet, who had encouraged her to write to Buckingham Palace after a particularly difficult day on the cancer ward. Janet smiled through her own tears. Maria, you've been caring for people at their most vulnerable moments for decades. The king just gave your work the recognition it deserves. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the head of oncology at the hospital, had paused in her rounds to listen to the broadcast. As a physician, she understood the courage it took for anyone to discuss their illness publicly, but seeing it done by someone in such a visible position felt revolutionary. This changes everything, she said quietly to the gathered staff. When public figures normalize conversations about illness and mortality, it helps reduce the stigma and isolation that so many of our patients experience. King Charles III continued sharing letters, each one revealing different aspects of human resilience in the face of difficulty. He read from a veteran struggling with post-traumatic stress, a teacher working in an underfunded school, a farmer facing financial ruin due to climate change, and an elderly man caring for his wife with dementia. With each letter, the broadcast became less about monarchy and more about the fundamental experiences that connect all people regardless of their social position. The king was demonstrating that true leadership meant not standing above human struggles, but walking alongside those who faced them. In the care home in Edinburgh, William MacLeod listened with increasing clarity as the king read a letter that Helen recognized immediately. It was the one she had sent describing her father's condition and her own challenges as his caregiver. Your Majesty, the king read, My father served his country with distinction for 40 years, and now he is slowly losing himself to dementia. Some days he doesn't recognize me, but occasionally he has moments of perfect clarity where he is entirely himself again. These moments have taught me that love persists even when memory fails, and that caring for someone whose mind is changing is one of the most profound acts of devotion we can offer. I wanted you to know that we are thinking of you, and that watching my father face his illness with dignity has prepared me to face whatever challenges lie ahead. Helen felt her father's hand tighten around hers as his letter was read. William's eyes were bright with understanding, and he spoke with remarkable clarity. That's us, Helen. That's our story he's telling. He paused, looking directly at his daughter. You've been so brave, love. Taking care of me when I can't remember how to take care of myself. The king understands what that costs you. Helen began crying, not from sadness but from relief. For months, she had felt isolated in her role as her father's caregiver, wondering if anyone understood the complex emotions involved in loving someone whose mind was changing. Hearing their experience acknowledged by the king in front of millions of people made her feel less alone than she had in months. At Westminster Abbey, King Charles III folded the letters carefully and returned them to his pocket. The simple gesture seemed to honor not just the words he had read, but the trust that letter writers had placed in him by sharing their stories. Each of these letters, he said, has reminded me that the crown I wear is not a burden I bear alone, but a symbol of our shared commitment to support one another through life's inevitable difficulties. The person facing cancer in Birmingham, the widower in Glasgow, the hospital worker in Manchester, the daughter caring for her father in Edinburgh, they are all showing the same courage that history has asked of kings and queens. The king paused, looking directly into the camera with an expression of profound sincerity. Today, I want to say something I have never said before in a Christmas broadcast. I need you as much as you need me. Your letters, your prayers, your examples of daily courage, these sustain me in ways that protocol and ceremony never could. This acknowledgement of mutual dependence between monarch and people represented a fundamental shift in how the British monarchy understood its role. For over 1,000 years, royal Christmas messages had emphasized service from sovereign to subjects. Today, King Charles III was acknowledging that the relationship was reciprocal, that his ability to serve depended on the strength and support he drew from the people he served. In homes across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth, viewers were processing this revolutionary idea. The monarchy was revealing itself not as an institution above human struggles, but as one intimately connected to them. The letters had transformed what could have been a somber announcement about royal illness into something far more profound, a meditation on how shared vulnerability creates genuine community and how acknowledging our mutual dependence makes us all stronger. As King Charles III prepared to conclude his historic Christmas broadcast, he walked slowly toward the high altar of Westminster Abbey. The ancient space seemed to hold its breath as viewers around the world realized they were witnessing not just a royal address, but a profound moment of transformation in the relationship between monarchy and people. As I stand here in this sacred place, the king began, his voice carrying both strength and tenderness, I am reminded that Christmas is not about avoiding life's difficulties, but about finding hope and meaning within them. The story we celebrate today is not one of power avoiding suffering, but of love choosing to enter into it. The theological implications of his words were not lost on Archbishop Michael Williams, who stood watching from the shadows near the sanctuary. In 40 years of ministry, he had rarely heard such a profound integration of personal vulnerability and spiritual wisdom from any public figure, let alone from the Supreme Governor of the Church of England. In Liverpool, Margaret Thompson found herself thinking about conversations she had shared with her late husband Robert during his final illness. Emma, she said quietly to her granddaughter, your grandfather used to say that the most important sermons were preached not by ministers in churches, but by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances with grace. I think we're hearing one of those sermons today. Emma nodded, her professional experience with families in crisis giving her deep appreciation for the courage the king was displaying. Gran, in my work at the Children's Hospital, I see parents find strength they never knew they had. But, seeing someone in the king's position acknowledge that same kind of struggle, it makes everyone's courage seem more valuable, doesn't it? The king continued, in these months since my diagnosis, I have learned that uncertainty about the future is not something to be conquered or avoided, but something to be faced with the support of those who walk beside us. I have discovered that admitting our need for help does not diminish our ability to help others, it enhances it. At the homeless shelter in Manchester, Susan Phillips watched as residents who often struggled with feelings of worthlessness found themselves deeply moved by the king's words about mutual dependence and support. Tommy, the veteran who had initially questioned why they were watching, spoke up again. He's saying we all matter to each other, isn't he? Even someone like me who lost everything, I still matter in some way. Susan smiled through her tears. Tommy, you've been helping people in this shelter for months without realizing it. Your experience gives you wisdom that helps others who are struggling. The king is saying that everybody's struggle contributes to everybody else's strength. An elderly woman named Dorothy, who rarely spoke about her past, surprised everyone by sharing her thoughts. I lost my home when my pension wasn't enough for rent anymore. I felt so ashamed, like I had failed somehow. But, listening to His Majesty talk about needing help, maybe needing help isn't failure. Maybe it's just being human. Back at Westminster Abbey, King Charles III approached the tomb of Queen Elizabeth I, his predecessor from over 400 years earlier. The symbolism was striking, a modern monarch acknowledging the temporary nature of all earthly authority while standing beside the memorial of one of England's most powerful rulers. The crown will pass to others when my time comes, he said with quiet dignity. But, the crown is not the point. The point is what we do with the time we are given, how we love the people entrusted to our care, and whether we choose honesty over comfort when facing difficult truths. In Southwark, James Foster felt his 8-year-old daughter Lucy lean more heavily against his shoulder. She had been unusually quiet throughout the broadcast, and he wondered what she was understanding of this unprecedented royal address. Daddy, Lucy said finally, the king is being brave like Mommy was when she was sick, isn't he? James felt his heart constrict with both pain and pride. Yes, sweetheart. He's showing us that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you are scared. Lucy considered this seriously. Is that why he's telling everyone about being sick? Because it's the right thing to do even though it's scary? I think so, Lucy. I think he wants people to know that it's okay to be scared sometimes, and that we can help each other through the scary times. At Westminster Abbey, the king moved to his final position for the broadcast, standing in the center of the abbey, surrounded by the tombs and memorials of centuries of British history, but speaking directly to the camera with an intimacy that transcended the grandeur of his surroundings. "My dear friends," he said, using the same phrase with which he had opened his address, "I want to leave you today with a promise and a request. The promise is this: for whatever time I have remaining as your king, I will continue to serve not as someone above your struggles, but as someone walking through them alongside you." Dr. Patricia Williams, watching from Oxford, realized she was witnessing a redefinition of monarchical authority. "Martin," she said to her neighbor, "he's not deriving his authority from divine right or constitutional tradition. He's deriving it from shared humanity." Martin Davies nodded slowly. "In 40 years of teaching history, I've never seen anything like this. He's making the monarchy relevant not by emphasizing its power, but by acknowledging its limitations." King Charles III continued with his request. "What I ask of you is this: continue to write to me, to share your stories, to let me know how you are finding strength in difficult circumstances. Your letters have become my greatest source of wisdom and courage. They remind me that leadership is not about having all the answers, but about being willing to learn from those you serve." The unprecedented nature of this request, a monarch asking his subjects to teach him rather than simply to obey him, represented a revolutionary understanding of the relationship between ruler and ruled. In Birmingham, Sarah Chen sat with her 3 children, all of them processing the extraordinary fact that their mother's letter had been read aloud by the king to hundreds of millions of people around the world. "Mummy," asked Sophie, "does this mean the king is our friend now?" Sarah smiled through her tears. "In a way, sweetheart. I think it means we're all friends with each other, all trying to help each other through hard times." The king's final words carried the weight of both personal conviction and historical significance. This Christmas, I encourage you to reach out to someone who might be struggling. Write a letter, make a phone call, offer practical help, or simply listen with genuine attention. These acts of connection are not small gestures, they are the foundation upon which strong communities and strong nations are built. He paused, looking once more around the ancient abbey that had witnessed so much of British history. "From this sacred place, where countless generations have sought comfort and meaning, I send you my love, my gratitude, and my commitment to honesty about the journey we all share." The king's final gesture was simple but powerful. He bowed slightly toward the camera, not in the formal manner of ceremonial protocol, but in the genuine acknowledgement of one human being recognizing the dignity and worth of others. "May this Christmas bring you peace in uncertainty, strength in difficulty, and the deep joy that comes from knowing you are not alone. God bless you all." As the broadcast concluded with the playing of the national anthem, viewers across the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth found themselves fundamentally changed by what they had witnessed. This had not been a traditional Christmas message, but a profound meditation on mortality, vulnerability, love, and the courage required to live authentically in the face of life's inevitable challenges. In care homes and hospitals, in shelters and palaces, in small flats and grand houses, people sat in contemplative silence, processing the king's words and their implications. Many reached for phones to call relatives they hadn't spoken to in months. Others began composing letters to friends who were struggling with illness or loss. The king's example of vulnerable honesty had given them permission to acknowledge their own fears and needs. The broadcast's impact extended far beyond Britain. In Commonwealth nations around the world, people who had watched their shared monarch reveal his mortality and humanity found themselves reflecting on their own relationships with authority, community, and mutual support. This Christmas Day of 2025 would be remembered not for pageantry or ceremony, but for a moment when one human being in a position of great responsibility chose radical honesty over comfortable distance, vulnerability over invulnerability, and connection over separation. King Charles III had transformed the Christmas broadcast from a formal address into a genuine conversation about what it means to live and love courageously in an uncertain world. In doing so, he had redefined not just the monarchy, but the very nature of leadership in the 21st century. As families across the nation began their Christmas celebrations, they carried with them the king's words and example, the understanding that strength comes not from avoiding life's difficulties, but from facing them together with honesty, compassion, and unwavering commitment to one another's well-being. The Royal Christmas broadcast of 2025 had become something unprecedented, a national moment of healing, connection, and transformed understanding that would resonate in hearts and minds for generations to come.